Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into medieval gardens where vegetables grew stranger, wilder, and far more interesting than anything you'll find in a modern supermarket. We're talking about 15 crops that once fed entire villages, roots that sweetened winter stews, leaves that cured ailments, bulbs that made even the poorest meal taste like something worth remembering. And then, slowly, quietly, they vanished. Not because they stopped growing, not because people stopped wanting them, but because somewhere along the way, big agriculture decided that efficiency mattered more than diversity, that uniformity was safer than flavor, and that three types of lettuce were enough for an entire civilization. You're lying in bed right now, probably scrolling through a device that can access the sum of human knowledge, but you can't taste a skirret. This root vegetable, sweet as a carrot, white as a parsnip, was served at Tudor banquets and grown in monastery gardens across Europe. Medieval cooks would simmer skirret in butter and wine. They'd roast it with honey. They'd serve it to kings. And now, you'd have better luck finding a unicorn at your farmer's market. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I love knowing that someone in Tokyo is drifting off while someone in Toronto is just settling in. Now here's where it gets interesting. These vegetables didn't just disappear randomly. There was a system, a slow, economic pressure that rewarded crops you could plant with machines, harvest with machines, and ship across continents without bruising. Skirret has delicate roots that tangle together. You can't just yank them up with a mechanical harvester. You have to dig carefully. Wash each root individually. That takes time. Time costs money, and money, as always, makes the decisions. By the 1800s, skirret had become a curiosity. By the 1900s, it was nearly extinct in commercial agriculture. Today, a few seed savers grow it in backyard plots, carefully preserving something that was once as common as potatoes. Historians still argue whether the decline of medieval vegetables was purely economic or if there was active suppression by emerging agricultural corporations. Some point to seed patents. Others mention the standardization of grocery supply chains in the early 20th century. But everyone agrees on one thing: diversity lost. Here's something that'll make you smile. In medieval England, there was a vegetable called Good King Henry. Not named after the infamous Tudor king, this was older. A leafy green that grew wild near farms and was eaten like spinach. It volunteered itself every spring without any planting required. Free food. Delicious free food. So naturally, commercial agriculture wanted nothing to do with it. Can't patent a weed. Can't sell seeds for something that just appears. Good King Henry still grows in the UK. Mostly ignored, mostly forgotten, waiting by roadsides like a friendly ghost of dinners past. Tonight, we're going to meet 15 of these lost vegetables. Some have names that sound like fantasy characters. Others taste like nothing you've experienced in a modern grocery store. A few still survive in defiant little patches, grown by people who remember. And as we move through each one, you'll start to notice something. These aren't just vegetables. They're a mirror showing us how much we've traded away for convenience. How much flavor we've forgotten. How many options we've let slip through our fingers. But don't worry, this isn't a tragedy. It's a bedtime story. A gentle reminder that the world once offered more variety than we can imagine now. And maybe, just maybe, some of these plants are still out there, growing, waiting, ready to be welcomed back. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first stop? A medieval root cellar, where winter vegetables waited in the dark, sweeter after every frost, telling stories to anyone patient enough to listen. You're standing at the entrance to a medieval root cellar now. Stone steps descending into cool darkness. The smell of earth and dried herbs. Wooden shelves lined with vegetables that knew how to wait. Parsnips, you know. Everyone's heard of parsnips. That sweet, pale root that tastes like a carrot went to finishing school. But parsnips had cousins. An entire family of roots that modern agriculture quietly left behind. Take skirret's neighbor, the Hamburg parsley root. Not the curly green herb you sprinkle on potatoes. This was a thick, cream-colored root that tasted like parsley and celery had a secret meeting. Medieval cooks used it in everything. Soups that simmered for hours. Stews that fed a dozen people from one pot. It stored beautifully through winter, getting sweeter as the months grew colder. But Hamburg parsley root has a problem. It's shaped irregularly. Twisted, sometimes forked. Washing machines can't handle it efficiently. Packaging equipment jams. So by the 1950s, it had mostly vanished from commercial production. You can still find it in Germany, sometimes. In Poland, occasionally. Grown by people whose grandmothers remembered. Here's where it gets wonderfully strange. Medieval Europeans were obsessed with a root called Alexander's, also known as horse parsley or black lovage. It grew wild along coastal areas, thriving in salty soil where other vegetables struggled. The entire plant was edible. Roots, stems, leaves, even the buds. It tasted pungent, almost celery-like, with a peppery finish that made winter meals interesting. Monks cultivated it in seaside monasteries. Coastal villages harvested it like a rite of spring. And then celery showed up. Domesticated celery, bred to be milder, straighter, less challenging to the palate. Alexander's couldn't compete with bland. By the Victorian era, it had returned to being a weed. Today, it still grows along British coastlines, confused about why humans stopped caring. Historians still argue whether Alexander's was deliberately phased out or simply lost the evolutionary race to milder vegetables that offended fewer taste buds. Some medieval food scholars point to recipe books from the 1500s where Alexander's appears frequently, then vanishes after 1650. Others suggest that as sugar became cheaper, people wanted less bitterness in their food. Either way, a perfectly good vegetable became a footnote. Now let's talk about salsify, the oyster plant. This long, thin root, beige and unimpressive looking, has been called the vegetable that tastes like the sea. When you cook it properly, it develops this subtle, almost shellfish-like flavor. Medieval and Renaissance Europeans loved it. They'd simmer it in cream, fry it in butter until golden, serve it alongside actual oysters, creating this earth meets ocean experience. Salsify stores well, grows reliably, and handles cold climates beautifully. So why did it disappear? Same reason as always. The roots grow deep and narrow. Harvesting requires careful digging. One rough pull and the root snaps, leaving half behind in the soil. Mechanical harvesters hate salsify. Grocery stores hate vegetables that require explanation. It tastes like oysters isn't a winning marketing strategy when you're trying to move pallets of produce. So salsify retreated to specialty catalogs and heritage seed collections. There's a darker version called scorzonera, black salsify. Same oyster flavor, but with a dramatic black skin. Even rarer now, even more forgotten. But here's something that'll make you smile. In the American colonies, settlers brought over a root called scurrit's cousin, the tuberous chervil. Not the delicate herb. This was a lumpy, knobby root vegetable that looked like tiny, dirty potatoes had a meeting. It tasted nutty and slightly sweet. Native Americans were apparently baffled by why Europeans wanted to cultivate something that looked so aggressively ugly. But colonists insisted, planting it in kitchen gardens from Massachusetts to Virginia. By the 1800s, gone, completely abandoned. No one's entirely sure why. Some food historians think it was just too labor-intensive to clean, all those knobs and crevices trapped dirt. Others suspect it simply couldn't compete with actual potatoes, which were easier to grow and less weird-looking. Either way, tuberous chervil joined the growing list of vegetables that time forgot. These root cellar outcasts share something important. They weren't weak plants. They didn't fail at being vegetables. They failed at being industrial products. They couldn't be planted by GPS-guided tractors. Couldn't be harvested by combines that process 30 tons per hour. Couldn't be washed, sorted, and packaged by machines that demand uniformity. So they stepped aside, or were pushed, quietly returning to the edges of fields, to wild places, to the gardens of people who still remember when food tasted like the soil it came from. You're getting sleepy now. That's okay. Let yourself drift. Imagine those root cellars full of forgotten vegetables, waiting patiently in the dark, sweeter with every passing frost. They're still there, in a way, still growing somewhere, still remembering when variety mattered more than efficiency. You're walking through a medieval meadow in early spring now. Everything's waking up, and the salad bowl looks nothing like you'd expect. Forget iceberg lettuce. Forget those plastic containers of spring mix that taste like crunchy water. Medieval salads were aggressive. They fought back. They had opinions. Dandelion greens, young, tender, and intensely bitter. Wild arugula that would make modern arugula taste like a gentle suggestion. Sorrel with its sharp, lemony bite that made your mouth pucker. Purslane, succulent and slightly sour. Chickweed, delicate but surprisingly peppery. People forage these greens from fields, forest edges, anywhere plants dare to grow. They didn't plant them mostly. Didn't need to. Nature provided, and medieval cooks knew exactly what to do with aggressive flavors. They'd mix bitter greens with vinegar, oil, salt, sometimes honey to balance the bite. Sometimes they'd wilt them slightly with warm bacon fat. The goal wasn't to mask the bitterness. It was to celebrate it, to create this complex interplay of sharp, sour, fatty, and sweet. Your modern palate has been trained to fear bitterness. Food corporations spent decades breeding it out of vegetables. Brussels sprouts that don't taste like Brussels sprouts. Kale that's been mellowed into submission. Radicchio that apologizes for existing. But medieval diners wanted that bitter edge. They believed it aided digestion, cleansed the blood, woke up the appetite after a long winter of stored roots and salted meat. Here's a fact that'll surprise you. The ancient Romans wrote extensively about lettuce varieties, at least 15 distinct types. By medieval times, European monks were cultivating dozens more. Cutting lettuces, heading lettuces, loose leaf varieties in red, green, and bronze. Each one adapted to local conditions. Each one with its own flavor profile. And then the industrial age arrived with a simple question. Which lettuce ships best? The answer was iceberg. Dense, compact, almost flavorless, and structurally sound enough to survive a cross-country train journey. By the 1920s, iceberg lettuce dominated American agriculture. Other varieties, delicate, flavorful, interesting, became specialty items, or disappeared entirely. Historians still argue whether the rise of iceberg lettuce was consumer-driven or corporation-driven. Some point to marketing campaigns that presented iceberg as modern and hygienic. Others note that shipping logistics made diverse lettuce varieties economically impossible. Either way, variety lost to convenience. Now let's talk about corn salad, also called mache, lamb's lettuce, or Rapunzel. This tiny, delicate green grew wild in grain fields across Europe. Farmers would find it volunteering between wheat rows, thriving in cool weather. It has this subtle, nutty flavor, tender leaves that practically melt on your tongue. And it's nutritious, packed with omega-3 fatty acids and vitamin C. Medieval peasants gathered it in early spring when nothing else was growing yet. A gift from the fields. Free nutrition. But corn salad has a fatal flaw for modern agriculture. The leaves are small. Harvesting requires careful handwork. You can't just run a machine through and strip everything. So it became boutique, expensive, something you might find at a farmer's market for $8 per tiny container. The medieval peasant eating corn salad for free would be absolutely bewildered by this development. Here's where it gets wonderfully weird. There was a green called patience stock. Yes, really, that was its name. A type of sorrel with massive leaves that could grow 3 feet tall. It tasted aggressively sour, almost metallic. But medieval cooks knew the secret. Young leaves in spring, tender and manageable. They'd use them in soups, in potages, mixed with milder greens to add complexity. The plant got its name because you needed patience to deal with its intense flavor. Or maybe because it tested your patience watching it grow so slowly in early spring. Either way, patience stock is now considered a weed, an invasive nuisance, something to be pulled up and discarded. The irony is delicious, if bitter. Medieval markets sold something called salad bundles. pre-mixed assortments of wild greens, each one contributing a different flavor. Bitter dandelions, peppery watercress, sour sorrel, mild chickweed, sharp mustard greens. The vendor would know which greens were at their peak that particular week, which ones needed to be balanced with others. It was an art form, a seasonal expression of whatever the fields were offering. Compare that to modern grocery stores where spring mix is the same 12 months a year, shipped from industrial farms in California or Arizona, tasting like a mild suggestion of vegetation. We've gained consistency. We've lost everything else. But here's the thing you need to remember as you drift towards sleep. Those bitter greens are still growing. Dandelions in your lawn, completely unaware they're unwanted. Purslane pushing through sidewalk cracks. Chickweed carpeting shady spots under trees. Wild arugula in abandoned lots. They never stopped being food. We just stopped recognizing them. And maybe, just maybe, there's something beautifully stubborn about that. About plants that refuse to disappear just because agriculture forgot they existed. Your eyelids are getting heavy now. Let them close. Imagine those medieval meadows in spring, covered in greens that actually taste like something. Bitter, sharp, complex alive. Still waiting for anyone brave enough to remember. You're standing inside monastery walls now. The air smells like turned earth and prayers. Monks move slowly between garden beds, tending plants like they're tending souls. And everywhere you look, there are beans. Not the three types, kidney, black, pinto. Dozens of varieties. Hundreds, maybe. Each one carefully saved, season after season, in the quiet tradition of people who think in decades instead of quarters. Medieval Europe ran on legumes. Protein for people who couldn't afford meat every day, or any day. Peas and beans filled the gap between surviving and thriving. But these weren't modern, uniform crops. They were landrace varieties, plants that had adapted over generations to specific valleys, specific soils, specific climates. A bean that thrived in wet Cornwall might struggle in dry Provence. So every region had its own. Every monastery garden told a different story in seeds. Take the fava bean, or broad bean, as the British call it. This was the bean of medieval Europe. Large, creamy, with a slightly bitter skin. It grew reliably in cool climates. Enriched the soil with nitrogen. Could be dried and stored for years if necessary. Roman soldiers carried dried fava beans on campaigns. Medieval peasants ate fava bean pottage through long winters. Monks grew dozens of fava varieties, each one suited to different purposes. Small beans for drying. Large beans for eating fresh. Pale green varieties, dark purple varieties. Early season, late season, everything in between. And then suddenly, in the 20th century, fava beans became exotic. Something you might find at a Middle Eastern restaurant. A curiosity. What happened? Soybeans happened. Industrial agriculture happened. The demand for crops that could be planted, harvested, and processed entirely by machine. Fava beans require careful handling. The pods are fuzzy and irregular. Each bean needs to be shelled individually if you want them fresh. Mechanical processing breaks them. So agriculture moved on to beans that cooperated better. And fava beans retreated to specialty markets and grandmother's gardens. Here's something that'll make you pause. Medieval monks cultivated a legume called the sheikling vetch, also known as grass pea or Spanish lentil. It's a small, angular legume that can grow in conditions that would kill other crops. Drought? Fine. Poor soil? No problem. It was survival food, insurance against famine. But there's a catch. If you eat nothing but sheikling vetch for months, a toxin builds up that can cause neurological problems. Medieval people knew this. They mixed it with other foods, ate it in moderation, treated it as one ingredient among many. But in the mid-20th century, several countries actually banned sheikling vetch cultivation. Too dangerous, they said. Better to eliminate it entirely than trust people to use it wisely. Historians still argue whether this was public health policy or agricultural protectionism, a way to discourage peasant farmers from growing their own protein instead of buying commercial feeds. Either way, another variety vanished from most fields. It still grows in Ethiopia and India, where people remember how to use it safely. Now let's talk about something wonderful. The Carlin pea. This small, brown pea was grown extensively in northern England, particularly around Lancashire. It was traditionally eaten on Carlin Sunday, the fifth Sunday of Lent. The peas would be soaked, boiled with bacon, and served hot. They have this nutty, earthy flavor that's nothing like modern sweet peas. Slightly chewy texture. Deeply satisfying. There's a legend that during a medieval siege, a ship carrying Carlin peas ran aground near a starving town. The peas saved everyone. Whether that's true or not, Carlin peas became tradition. And then they almost disappeared. By the 1990s, only one farm in England was still growing them commercially. One farm. One man who remembered. The peas couldn't be mechanically harvested. Too small, too irregular. Modern consumers didn't know what to do with them. Grocery stores had no interest. But that one farmer kept planting, kept harvesting, kept saving seeds. And slowly, gradually, people started remembering. Now you can find Carlin peas again if you look hard enough. Still rare. Still special. Still refusing to completely disappear. Medieval monasteries kept something called seed libraries. Not libraries in the modern sense. Just careful collections of seeds, saved year after year, with notes about which varieties performed best in which conditions. Monks would trade seeds with other monasteries. A particularly good bean from Bavaria might end up in Scotland. A hardy pea from the coast might travel inland. This was agriculture as a conversation, slow, careful, accumulating wisdom over centuries. Compare that to modern seed patents, where corporations own the genetics of plants and farmers are forbidden from saving seeds. Where diversity is seen as inefficient. Where a bad harvest can't be solved by trying a different variety because there is no different variety. Just the one that's been engineered for maximum yield under ideal conditions. The monks would be horrified, or maybe just confused. Why would you put all your faith in one type of seed? What happens when conditions aren't ideal? What happens when the climate shifts? Those are questions we're starting to ask again, centuries too late. You're feeling that gentle pull towards sleep now. That's good. Let it happen. Imagine those monastery gardens, row after row of different beans and peas. Each one a small miracle of adaptation. Each one saved and shared by people who understood that variety itself was a form of insurance, of hope. The monks are still there, in a way. Still planting in the gardens of memory. Still saving seeds that refuse to be forgotten. You're in a different kind of garden now. The air has changed. Sharp, pungent, unmistakable. Welcome to the allium family reunion that modern agriculture tried very hard to cancel. You know onions and garlic. Everyone knows onions and garlic. But medieval Europe grew a whole orchestra of pungent bulbs and stems that most people today have never even heard of. Ramsons, for instance. Wild garlic that carpeted forest floors in spring. The leaves look like lily of the valley but smell like garlic's louder, more confident cousin. Medieval foragers would gather ramsons by the basketful. The entire plant was edible, leaves, flowers, bulbs. They'd use it fresh in spring dishes, pickle it for later, dry the bulbs like garlic cloves. It was free food with serious flavor. Growing everywhere, humans didn't specifically try to stop it. And yet, try finding ramsons at a grocery store today. You won't. Can't be harvested mechanically. Can't be stored for long periods. The leaves wilt quickly. The bulbs are tiny and time-consuming to process. So ramsons retreated to the wild, still growing in British woodlands, still confused about why nobody wants it anymore. Here's where it gets interesting. There was an allium called rocambole, serpent garlic. It grows these spectacular curling flower stalks that loop and twist like something from a Dr. Seuss book. The bulbs grow underground like regular garlic, but also produces tiny bulbils at the top of those curling stalks, aerial cloves you could harvest and plant. Medieval gardeners loved rocambole. It was hardy, flavorful, productive, and honestly just fun to look at. The flavor sits somewhere between garlic and shallots. Complex, slightly milder than standard garlic, perfect for long-cooked dishes. But rocambole has a fatal flaw for modern agriculture. Those curling stalks make mechanical harvesting impossible. The bulbs form irregular clumps underground instead of neat, uniform heads. And it takes up garden space for nearly a year before you can harvest. So agriculture standardized around regular garlic. Specifically, the California early variety, uniform, white, machine-compatible. Rocambole became an heirloom curiosity, something seed catalogs mention with nostalgia. Now let's talk about tree onions. Yes, really. They're also called walking onions or Egyptian onions, though they're not from Egypt. Nobody's quite sure why they're called Egyptian. Medieval naming conventions were more poetic than accurate. Here's how tree onions work, and it's delightfully weird. The plant grows like a regular onion at first, but instead of flowering, it produces a cluster of tiny bulbs at the top of a tall stalk. Those top bulbs get heavy. Eventually, the stalk bends over from the weight and touches the ground. The bulbs root where they land. The plant literally walks across your garden over the years, planting itself. Medieval gardeners thought this was hilarious and useful. You plant once, and the onion handles its own propagation. Forever. It never dies back completely. Always something to harvest. Either the underground bulbs, or the top-set bulbs, or the green stalks. But tree onions are chaos. They don't stay where you plant them. They can't be farmed in neat rows. Mechanical harvesting would have an existential crisis trying to figure out where the crop actually is. So modern agriculture said no thank you. Too unpredictable. Too autonomous. Tree onions still grow in backyard gardens, walk their way across America with settlers, and continue walking to this day, cheerfully ignoring the concept of agricultural planning. Historians still argue whether the decline of diverse alliums was economic necessity or deliberate corporate consolidation. Some point to the rise of California garlic growers in the 1920s who pushed for standardization. Others note that most heirloom alliums simply couldn't compete once mechanization became a norm. Either way, we went from dozens of options to essentially 3: onions, garlic, and sometimes shallots if you're fancy. Here's something that'll make you smile. There was an allium called currit, Egyptian leek, though again with the Egyptian thing. It's actually from the Eastern Mediterranean. Currit looks like a leek, but tastes more like a very mild garlic. You harvest it by cutting the leaves repeatedly. It keeps growing back. Medieval Middle Eastern gardens always had currit. It was the reliable green thing that never quit. You could harvest leaves year-round in the right climate. But currit can't be sold in neat bundles like modern leeks. The leaves are narrower, the plant doesn't form a thick white shaft, and trying to explain to shoppers that it's a perennial leaf garlic that tastes like a leek would require marketing genius. So it vanished from commercial production. It still grows in home gardens across Lebanon, Syria, and Egypt, still reliably producing, still being ignored by global agriculture. The allium family has this beautiful quality. They're survival plants. They store well. They add flavor to otherwise monotonous diets. They grow in marginal conditions, and they never really disappear. Ramsons is still carpeting European forests every spring. Tree onions are still walking through American gardens. Rocambole is still producing those twisted flower stalks for anyone patient enough to grow it. They didn't fail as plants. They just refused to cooperate with industrialization. And maybe that's the most allium thing possible. Being too pungent, too irregular, too stubbornly themselves to fit into someone else's system. Your breathing is slower now. Deeper. That's good. Let yourself drift with the thought of those wild garlic fields in spring, covered in white flowers, smelling like every good meal you've ever had. Still growing. Still waiting. Still pungent after all these years. You're standing at the edge of a medieval village now, where the gardens blur into wild places, where weeds and vegetables have stopped pretending there's a difference. This is pot herb territory, the realm of leaves that fed millions of people who couldn't afford to be picky. Good King Henry, we mentioned earlier, remember that friendly weed? Let's spend more time with it. The botanical name is Chenopodium bonus henricus, which sounds far more dignified than it deserves. It's a squat, leafy green that grows about knee-high, related to spinach and quinoa. The leaves taste somewhere between spinach and asparagus. Young shoots in spring can be eaten like asparagus spears. Older leaves work perfectly in stews and pottages. And here's the beautiful part. You plant it once, just once, and it comes back year after year. A perennial vegetable that asks for nothing and gives constantly. Medieval cottage gardens always had a patch of good King Henry lurking somewhere. But perennial vegetables have a problem in modern agriculture. You can't till the field every year. Can't rotate crops efficiently. Can't apply the standard schedule of planting, spraying, harvesting that industrial farms depend on. Perennials are chaos. They have their own timeline. So good King Henry joined the ranks of unemployed vegetables, still showing up uninvited in British hedgerows, still edible, still ignored. Now meet fat hen. Yes, that's really what it's called. Chenopodium album, a close relative of good King Henry. This was survival food. Archaeology shows that fat hen seeds were eaten throughout prehistoric Europe. Medieval peasants considered it barely a step above grass. But when crops failed, when famine arrived, fat hen was still growing, still producing edible leaves and nutritious seeds. The leaves taste mild, slightly mineral-rich. The seeds can be ground into flour or cooked like grain. It grows in terrible soil, thrives on neglect, produces abundantly without any care whatsoever. And for exactly those reasons, modern agriculture wants nothing to do with it. Can't commodify a weed. Can't sell something that grows itself for free everywhere. Fat hen is now officially classified as an invasive pest in most agricultural guidelines. Medieval peasants would find that designation absolutely baffling. Here's where it gets wonderfully strange. There was a pot herb called oriche, also spelled several dozen other ways because medieval spelling was more of a suggestion. Mountain spinach, some called it. It came in red, yellow, and green varieties. Tall plants, sometimes 6 feet high, with arrow-shaped leaves. The flavor is similar to spinach, but slightly tangier. Victorian gardeners actually loved oriche. They'd grow the red variety as an ornamental plant and a vegetable. The leaves would add color to salads. Young shoots could be cooked. It was practical and pretty. But oriche grows too tall for mechanical harvesting. The leaves are delicate and bruise easily. And people kept confusing it with lamb's quarters, its weedy cousin. So oriche gradually disappeared from seed catalogs. You can still find it if you search heirloom varieties. Still growing in a few specialty gardens. Still confused about what it did wrong. Medieval kitchens had something called pot herbs. Not pot herbs as one word, but literally herbs for the pot. This was a category of greens that you'd throw into stews, soups, pottages. Nettle tops. Yes, stinging nettles, but cooked they're safe and delicious. Sorrel for sourness. Parsley for freshness. Good King Henry for body. Chickweed for delicate flavor. You'd gather whatever was growing that week, chop it up, add it to the pot. Every pot herb added nutrients, flavor, complexity. And it was free. Completely free. Just knowledge in a basket. Historians still argue whether the decline of foraging culture was driven by urbanization or by agricultural interests who benefited from people buying vegetables instead of gathering them. Some scholars point to enclosure laws in the 1700s that made foraging on common land illegal. Others suggest that as groceries became more accessible, people simply forgot how to identify wild edibles. Either way, an entire category of free food became invisible. Here's a fact that might surprise you. Nettle soup was standard peasant fare throughout medieval Europe. You'd harvest the young tops in spring, wearing gloves, obviously. Boil them until the sting disappeared. Blend with onions, maybe some oats for thickness, a bit of salt. The result is earthy, rich, surprisingly hearty. And nettles are absurdly nutritious. More protein than spinach, loaded with iron and vitamins. They still grow everywhere. Anywhere humans disturb soil, nettles appear. But try suggesting to someone today that they should eat the weeds from their backyard. They'll look at you like you've suggested eating the carpet. We've lost the language of wild food. Lost the knowledge that sustained humans for millennia. And in its place, we have spinach. Just spinach. One type of green to rule them all. Bred to be mild, inoffensive, uniform. Medieval peasants eating fat hen and good King Henry in nettle soup had more variety in their greens than most modern people will experience in their entire lives. That's not romantic nostalgia. That's just mathematics. You're feeling that gentle tug toward deeper rest now. Your thoughts are slowing down. That's exactly right. Let yourself imagine those cottage gardens where the edges are blurry, where nettles and orichae and good King Henry all grew together in productive chaos, where nothing was a weed if you knew how to cook it. Those plants are still there, still growing in the margins, still edible, still waiting for anyone who remembers their names. You're in a different garden now, cooler climate, Northern Europe, maybe Scotland, Germany, Scandinavia. And everywhere you look, there are brassicas, the cabbage family in all its weird, wonderful glory. Medieval Europe didn't just grow cabbage. It grew an entire parliament of crucifers, each one adapted to specific conditions, specific uses, specific tastes. Tight-headed cabbages for storage, loose-leaf cabbages for fresh eating, red cabbages for color and pickling, Savoy cabbages with crinkled leaves that held onto sauces, pointed cabbages that matured early in spring, winter cabbages that could survive frost, kohlrabi, that bizarre alien-looking thing where the stem swells into a bulb above ground, kale in 20 different forms, from curly to flat to palm tree height, sea kale that grew on coastal cliffs, walking stick kale that literally grew tall enough to be used as a walking stick. Every region had its favorites. Every microclimate had varieties that worked best there. This wasn't just agriculture. It was botanical democracy. And then the seed companies arrived with a different vision. For types of cabbage, maybe 5 if you're lucky. Green, red, Savoy, Napa. That's it. That's the selection. Everything else, every weird, wonderful, locally adapted variety, became heirloom. Code word for obsolete. Here's something that'll make you pause. There was a cabbage called January King, bred specifically to survive harsh winters and be harvested in January when nothing else was growing. The heads would sit in frozen fields, perfectly preserved by the cold. Farmers could harvest fresh cabbage in the dead of winter. The outer leaves would turn purple-red from the frost. The inner leaves stayed sweet and tender. It was a miracle of plant breeding. Medieval people selecting, year after year, for the toughest, most winter-hardy plants. January King still exists. You can find seeds if you search hard enough. But modern agriculture prefers to grow cabbage in California and ship it to cold climates. Why breed for hardiness when you could just use trucks? The question answers itself. Now let's talk about sea kale. Crameritoma, if you want the fancy name. This plant grows wild on coastal beaches and cliffs throughout northern Europe. It looks nothing like regular kale. Thick, blue-gray leaves with a waxy coating. In spring, it produces white flowers that smell like honey. And the young shoots, when you blanch them by covering the plant to block light, taste like a cross between asparagus and hazelnuts. Absolutely sublime. Medieval coastal communities harvested sea kale from the wild. Victorian gardeners cultivated it deliberately, forcing the shoots in darkness to make them tender. It was considered a delicacy. But sea kale has problems. It takes 3 years to establish from seed. The harvest season is brief, just a few weeks in early spring. Each plant produces relatively little, and you need to know what you're doing to force the shoots properly. So sea kale became impractical. Too slow, too finicky, too specialized. It retreated back to wild coastlines where it still grows, still producing those honey-scented flowers, still completely ignored by modern agriculture. Historians still argue whether the standardization of brassicas was driven by consumer demand or by seed companies consolidating power. Some point to the rise of F1 hybrid seeds in the 1950s, varieties that couldn't be saved because they don't breed true. Others note that grocery stores demanded year-round availability, which required varieties that could be grown anywhere and shipped everywhere. Either way, diversity collapsed. Here's where it gets wonderfully weird. Walking stick kale, also called Jersey kale or cow cabbage, could grow 10 feet tall. The stems would become thick and woody. After harvest, people would dry the stems and literally use them as walking sticks. The leaves were fed to livestock. The stalks served double duty as tools. It was agriculture as multipurpose design. But walking stick kale takes 2 years to reach full height. It occupies space for a long time. And nobody needs a kale-based walking stick when you can buy metal cane. So walking stick kale became extinct in most areas. There are reports of it still growing in Jersey, the island, not the state. Still towering over gardens. Still stubbornly producing leaves and stalks nobody wants. Medieval kale wasn't the superfood darling of modern health food stores. It was survival food. Different varieties for different purposes. Curly kale with leaves that could be stripped off the stem repeatedly without killing the plant. Flat kale that was more tender and faster growing. Tree kale, yes, another tree vegetable that would produce for years. Russian kale that could survive temperatures that would kill other plants. Each one filled a niche. Each one solved a problem. And each one required knowledge. When to plant it, how to harvest it, what to do with it. Knowledge that took generations to accumulate. Knowledge that disappeared in a single generation when people stopped planting. Modern kale is a compromise, bred to be acceptable to everyone, which means it's not perfectly suited to anyone. Lacy NATO kale, curly kale, maybe red Russian if you're at a fancy store. That's the menu. Medieval farmers would look at that selection and wonder what happened to the other 15 types. You're drifting now. Your breathing has found that perfect rhythm, slow and steady, like the seasons medieval gardeners knew by heart. Let yourself imagine those winter fields with January king cabbages sitting under snow. Those coastal cliffs with sea kale clinging to rocks. Those impossibly tall walking stick kales swaying in the wind. All those varieties still growing somewhere. Still adapted perfectly to their specific places. Still waiting. You're in that liminal space between waking and sleeping now, where stories feel like memories, where the past touches the present. And in this space, some vegetables refuse to be history. They're still here, still growing, still stubbornly producing in the gardens of people who remember. Salsify, we met earlier, that oyster-flavored root. But let's dig deeper into its story, because salsify represents something important. It's a vegetable that knows it's been forgotten and simply doesn't care. You can still buy salsify seeds from specialty catalogs. Still plant them in your garden. Still harvest those long, beige roots after the first frost. The plant grows tall, 3 or 4 feet, with grass-like leaves. In its second year, it produces these spectacular purple flowers. Some gardeners grow it just for the flowers. The roots become secondary. And maybe that's how salsify survived, by being beautiful enough to keep around even when people stopped eating it. There's a trick to cooking salsify that medieval cooks knew instinctively. The roots oxidize quickly when cut. They turn brown and bitter. So you need to drop them immediately into water with lemon juice or vinegar. Then you can roast them, fry them, simmer them in cream. The oyster flavor emerges slowly, subtly. It's not aggressive. It's a whisper of the sea in a root that grew miles inland. Modern recipe books rarely mention salsify, but it keeps growing anyway. In France, especially, where culinary memory runs deeper. In Belgium, where traditional cooking still values complexity. In the gardens of people who learned from grandparents who learned from their grandparents. Now let's talk about scorzonera. Black salsify. Same family, same oyster flavor, but with this dramatic black skin. If salsify is the forgotten vegetable, scorzonera is the forgotten vegetable's mysterious sibling who wears all black. The Spanish called it viper's grass because they believed it could cure snake bites. It can't, obviously, but the name stuck. Medieval herbalists grew it for medicinal purposes. Cooks discovered it made excellent eating. The black skin peels away to reveal pure, white flesh underneath. And unlike salsify, scorzonera doesn't oxidize as quickly. You can cut it and it stays white. This should have been an advantage. Should have made it more commercially viable than salsify. But scorzonera made the same mistake as its cousin. It grows long and narrow, requires deep, loose soil, can't be harvested efficiently by machine. So it joins salsify in the realm of specialty vegetables that most people will never taste. Here's something that'll make you smile. There's a radish called black Spanish, not the little red radishes you put in salads. This is a massive, black-skinned winter radish that can grow the size of a softball. The flavor is intense, spicy, pungent, almost aggressive. Medieval Germans loved black Spanish radish. They'd slice it thin and eat it with bread and beer. The spice cut through the richness of winter food. It's stored beautifully in root cellars, and it was hardy enough to grow in climates where gentler vegetables gave up. Black Spanish radish still exists. You can find it at farmers markets sometimes. Eastern European communities never stopped growing it, slicing it paper-thin with special radish planes, salting it to draw out some of the bite, serving it as part of winter spreads that taste like defiance, like flavor refusing to be mild. Historians still argue whether these roots survive because of deliberate preservation efforts or simply because they're too stubborn to go extinct. Some point to immigrant communities who brought seeds to new countries and kept planting them. Others note that these vegetables grow almost as weeds. They don't require coddling. Either way, they're still here, still producing, still waiting for mainstream agriculture to remember they exist. Here's a fact you might not expect. Celeriac, that knobby, ugly root vegetable that looks like a brain had a bad day, was actually quite popular in medieval Europe. It's the root form of celery, bred specifically for a large, flavorful root instead of stalks. The taste is intense, concentrated celery flavor with nutty undertones. Medieval cooks would roast it, mash it, add it to stews. Victorian cooks made it into soups and gratins. And then, somehow, celeriac became exotic. Something you might find at specialty stores. Something most people wouldn't recognize. Even though it's easier to grow than stalk celery. Stores better. Has more flavor. The problem is purely aesthetic. Celeriac is ugly. Magnificently, uncompromisingly ugly. Covered in roots and knobs and irregular surfaces that trap dirt. Modern consumers want vegetables that look like they came from a catalog. Smooth, uniform, Instagrammable. Celeriac looks like it came from a nightmare about vegetables. So it remains niche. Still grown in Europe, especially France and Germany. Still delicious. Still ugly. Still refusing to apologize for its appearance. There's something beautiful about vegetables that won't die. That keep growing despite being economically obsolete. Despite not fitting into modern agriculture's narrow vision. They grow in the gardens of stubborn people. People who plant seeds because their grandmother planted them. People who value flavor over convenience. People who understand that diversity isn't just nice to have, it's insurance. Against climate change. Against crop failures. Against the day when uniformity stops working. These roots, salsify and scorzonera and black Spanish radish and celeriac, they're not historical curiosities. They're living options. Seeds in freezers and gardens. Recipes in old cookbooks and family memories. Flavors that never went away, just got quieter. You're very sleepy now. That's perfect. Let yourself sink deeper. Imagine those root cellars full of vegetables that refuse to be forgotten. Black-skinned scorzonera lying next to pale salsify. Massive black Spanish radishes with their peppery defiance. Knobby celeriac, magnificently ugly and completely unbothered. All of them waiting. All of them still here. All of them growing somewhere right now, in soil that remembers. You're somewhere very cold now. Arctic cold. Permafrost cold. Deep inside a mountain on a Norwegian island called Svalbard. This isn't medieval anymore. This is now. But the seeds inside tell medieval stories. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault sits 400 feet inside a sandstone mountain, frozen to minus 18 degrees Celsius. It holds over 1 million seed samples. Backup copies of the world's crop diversity. Insurance against the apocalypse. Against war, climate change, crop disease, human stupidity. And somewhere in those frozen chambers, medieval vegetables wait. Seeds of skirret and salsify. Good King Henry and fat hen. Rocambole and tree onions. January king cabbage and walking stick kale. All preserved in case we ever need them again. In case uniformity fails us. In case the three types of lettuce we've standardized around all succumb to the same disease. In case we wake up one day and realize that diversity wasn't optional. It was survival. The seed vault doesn't advertise which varieties it holds. That's not the point. The point is preservation, keeping options alive until someone, someday, needs them. But here's what's fascinating. The seed vault isn't a museum. It's not a collection of dead things. These seeds are alive, dormant, frozen, but alive, ready to grow the moment conditions are right. Every few years, samples are tested for viability. Germination rates checked. If they're declining, fresh seeds are added from seed banks around the world. It's a living library of possibilities. And among those possibilities are vegetables that medieval farmers would recognize immediately. Plants they bred, selected, saved, year after year, generation after generation. Plants that contain centuries of accumulated wisdom about how to survive in specific climates, specific soils. That knowledge is encoded in the genetics. You can't write it down. You can only preserve the seeds and hope someone remembers how to read them. Here's something that'll make you think. Before the seed vault existed, we lost varieties constantly. Wars would destroy seed collections. Famines would force people to eat their seed grain. Political upheaval would scatter communities that had maintained varieties for centuries. The Irish potato famine happened partly because Ireland depended on one type of potato. When a disease adapted to that one type, millions starved. If they'd maintained the diversity of potato varieties that existed in South America, hundreds of types, each with different resistances, the famine might never have happened, or wouldn't have been as catastrophic. That lesson cost 1 million lives to learn, and we're still learning it. Historians still argue whether modern seed banking is sufficient or if we need living preservation, actual farms growing diverse varieties instead of just storing seeds in freezers. Some point out that seeds in vaults can evolve, can adapt to changing conditions. Others note that without the vault, we'd be losing varieties faster than we could possibly preserve them through cultivation. Both are probably right. The ideal would be both. Seeds in the vault as backup. Seeds in the ground, growing, adapting, being used. But that requires people to actually plant medieval vegetables, to accept diversity, to value flavor and resilience over uniformity and convenience. We're not there yet, but the seeds are waiting. Here's where it gets hopeful, though. There's been a quiet revolution happening. Seed savers, heritage seed companies, community seed libraries. People who've decided that diversity matters, that flavor matters, that having options matters. They're planting skirret in backyard gardens, growing good King Henry in community plots, saving seeds of January king cabbage to share with neighbors. It's small, it's scattered, but it's happening. Medieval vegetables returning to gardens, one stubborn grower at a time. Not because they're profitable, not because grocery stores demand them, but because some people remember, or have learned, or just got curious about what food used to taste like. There's a seed company in the UK that specializes in medieval vegetables, another in the US that focuses on pre-1900 varieties, several in Europe that maintain regional heirlooms. They're not big operations. They're people with greenhouses and patience, carefully growing out varieties, harvesting seeds, packaging them, sending them to gardeners who want something different. It's agriculture as resistance, as memory, as hope. The Svalbard Vault also holds seeds from seed savers, individual gardeners who've maintained varieties in their families for generations. A grandmother in Italy who's been saving the same tomato seeds since 1947. A farmer in India who grows 17 types of rice. A gardener in Mexico maintaining corn varieties that are thousands of years old. Their seeds are in the vault too, preserved alongside institutional collections. Because genetic diversity doesn't care about pedigree. It cares about options, about having enough variety that something will survive when conditions change. And conditions always change. You're so close to sleep now. Your breathing is slow and deep. Perfect. Let yourself imagine those frozen chambers. Millions of seeds waiting patiently in the dark. Medieval vegetables dreaming their slow, cold dreams. Ready to grow again. Ready to remember the sun and soil and the hands that saved them. They're not extinct. They're not even gone. They're just resting, waiting for us to remember that diversity isn't a luxury. It's the only reason anything survives. You're almost asleep now. Almost. Just one more gentle step in a rest. And you're back where we started, in a medieval garden. But this time it's different. This time you can see the whole picture. All those forgotten vegetables we've met tonight. Skirret with its tangled, sweet roots. Hamburg parsley and Alexander's growing along the edges. Salsify and scorzonera side by side. One pale, one dark. Good King Henry volunteering itself between the rows. Nettle and fat hen at the boundaries where garden becomes wild. Rocambole with its serpentine flower stalks. Tree onions walking slowly across the plot, year after year. Ramsons carpeting the shady corner, white flowers glowing. Oriche standing tall, with red and green leaves mixing. January king cabbage waiting for frost to make it sweeter. Sea kale on the wall, where salt spray reaches. Walking stick kale, towering over everything else. Black Spanish radish hidden underground, saving its spicy secret for winter. Celeriac, magnificently ugly, unbothered by appearances. And everywhere, in every corner, the knowledge that this abundance once existed. Not in some fantasy, not in some idealized past, but in real gardens, feeding real people year after year, century after century. This wasn't just agriculture. It was a conversation between humans and plants that lasted thousands of years. We learned what they needed. They adapted to what we wanted. Together, we created diversity, not for its own sake, but because diversity was the only strategy that worked when conditions were unpredictable. When the weather changed, when diseases arrived, when war or famine or simple bad luck threatened the harvest. Having 15 types of cabbage was an excess. It was wisdom, having vegetables that volunteered themselves, that walked across gardens, that survived frost and drought and neglect. That was resilience. And we traded almost all of it for convenience, for uniformity, for the ability to plant and harvest with machines, for vegetables that could survive a week in a truck, for produce that looked perfect under fluorescent lights. We made that trade consciously, mostly, though perhaps without fully understanding what we were losing. And now some of us are trying to trade back, one garden at a time, one packet of seeds at a time, one stubborn grower deciding that flavor matters more than efficiency. That diversity has value. That medieval vegetables aren't historical curiosities. They're options we might desperately need. The beautiful thing, the truly beautiful thing, is that it's not too late. Those plants still exist. Maybe not in grocery stores. Maybe not in commercial fields. But somewhere. In seed vaults under Norwegian mountains, yes. But also in backyard gardens. In monastery plots that never stopped growing them. In immigrant communities that brought seeds across oceans. In wild places where they volunteered themselves and keep growing despite being forgotten. Ramsons in British woodlands, still covering forest floors every spring. Tree onions walking through American gardens, cheerfully autonomous. Good King Henry appearing uninvited in hedgerows, still edible after all these years. They didn't need us to remember. They just kept growing. And now, slowly, gradually, we're starting to remember them. Starting to plant them again. Starting to taste what food used to taste like when diversity was normal. When bitter was acceptable. When vegetables had strong opinions and didn't apologize. This isn't nostalgia. This is practical. Climate change is making weather unpredictable. Crop diseases are evolving faster than ever. The varieties we've standardized around are increasingly vulnerable. And somewhere in the genetics of those forgotten vegetables, the ones that survived frost and drought and neglect, are the traits we might need to survive the next century. The ability to grow in marginal conditions, to resist new diseases, to adapt quickly, to feed people reliably when the easy options fail. Medieval farmers didn't save 15 types of cabbage because they were sentimentalists. They saved them because they'd learned, through hard experience, that putting all your faith in one variety was a recipe for starvation. That lesson is still true, will always be true, and the seeds are still here, waiting for us to learn again. So as you drift into sleep now, truly sleep, deep and restful and peaceful sleep, let yourself carry this gentle thought. Those vegetables are still growing somewhere, still producing seeds, still waiting in frozen vaults and warm gardens, still adapted perfectly to the specific conditions that created them. And maybe someday soon, they'll be common again. Not as novelties, not as heritage curiosities, but as normal, as obvious, as essential as they once were. 15 types of cabbage in your grocery store. 7 types of onions that taste completely different. Roots you've never heard of, but that your great-great-grandparents ate regularly. Greens that actually have flavor. Diversity as the default instead of the exception. That's not impossible. It's just forgotten. And forgotten things can be remembered, especially by people like you, who took the time tonight to learn their names, to hear their stories, to understand what we lost and what we might yet regain. So sleep now, deep and peaceful. Let those medieval gardens bloom in your dreams. Every variety present, every flavor alive, every seed waiting patiently for spring. You've learned something tonight, something important, something that might matter more than you know. And tomorrow, if you're curious, you could search for those seeds. Plant one forgotten vegetable. Taste what diversity used to mean. Remember what we're trying so hard to preserve. But for now, just rest. The gardens are still there. The seeds are safe. And morning will come, as it always does, with new chances to grow something beautiful, something delicious, something that refuses to be forgotten. Sweet dreams.